Article 16. Although a true believer, whether baptized or unbaptized, be in the state of salvation, and shall certainly be saved, yet in obedience to the command of Christ, every believer ought to desire baptism, and to yield himself to be baptized according to the rule of Christ in his word. And where this obedience is in faith performed, there Christ makes this his ordinance a means of unspeakable benefit to the believing soul. Acts 2:38 and Acts 22:16. Romans 6:3 and 4, 1 Peter 3:21. And a true believer that here sees the command of Christ lying upon him cannot allow himself in disobedience thereunto. Acts 24:16. Article 17. Believers baptized ought to agree and join together in a constant profession of the same doctrine of the gospel, and in professed obedience thereunto, and also in fellowship, and in breaking of bread, and in prayers. Acts 2:42. And a company of baptized believers so agreeing and joining together are a church or a congregation of Christ. Acts 2:47. Article 18. As the preaching of the gospel, both for the conversion of sinners and the edifying of those that are converted, so also the right use of baptism and of the Lord's Supper ought to be till the end of the world. Matthew 28:19 and 20, 1 Corinthians 11:26. Article 19. A disciple gifted and enabled by the Spirit of Christ to preach the gospel, and stirred up to this service by the same Spirit, bringing home to his soul the command of Christ in his word for the doing of this work, is a man authorized and sent by Christ to preach the gospel. See Luke 19:12, etc., Mark 16:15, and Matthew 28:19. Compared with Acts 8:4, Philippians 1:14 and 15, John 7, which verse is uncertain. And those gifted disciples which thus preach Christ Jesus, who came in the flesh, are to be looked upon as men sent and given of the Lord. 1 John 4:2, Romans 10:15, Ephesians 4:11-13. And they which are converted from unbelief and false worship, and so brought into church fellowship by such preachers according to the will of Christ, are a seal of their ministry. 1 Corinthians 9:2. And such preachers of the gospel may not only lawfully administer baptism unto believers and guide the action of the church in the use of the supper, Matthew 28:19, Acts 8:5-12, 1 Corinthians 10:16, but in fulfillment of the office of eldership may also call upon the churches and advise them to choose other fit men for officers, and may settle such officers so chosen by a church in the places or offices of elder or deacon, to which they are chosen by imposition of hands and prayer. Acts 6:3-6, Acts 14:23, and Titus 1:5. Article 20. Though a believer's right to use of the Lord's Supper does immediately flow from Jesus Christ, apprehended and received by faith, yet inasmuch as all things ought to be done not only decently, but also in order, 1 Corinthians 14:40, and the Word holds forth this order, that disciples should be baptized, Matthew 28:19, Acts 2:38, and then be taught to observe all things, that is to say, all other things, that Christ commanded the apostles, Matthew 28:20, and accordingly the apostles first baptized disciples, and then admitted them to the use of the supper, Acts 2:41 and 42. We therefore do not admit any in the use of the supper, nor communicate with any in the use of this ordinance, but disciples baptized, lest we should have fellowship with them in their doing contrary to order. Article 21. Although we know that in some things we are yet very dark, and in all things as yet we know but in part, and do therefore wait upon God for further light, yet we believe that we ought in our practice to obey and serve and glorify God in the use of that light which He has given us, and not neglect the good using of that light which God hath already given us, under pretense of wanting for more. 1 Corinthians 13:9 and Acts 18:25. Article 22. As Christ does not teach nor allow that we should be without natural affection or unsociable, see Romans 1:31, so our being made partakers of Christ does not discharge us from the duties of our relations. Believing servants must perform the duties of servants towards their masters, though unbelieving, 1 Timothy 6:1. So believing children must perform the duties of children toward their parents, Colossians 3:20. Believing wives the duty of wives toward their husbands, 1 Peter 3:1. And believing subjects must be subject to principalities and powers and obey magistrates, Romans 13:1. Titus 3:1, 1 Peter 2:13 through 15. But still they must remember that their fear toward God must not be taught by the precept of men, Isaiah 29:13. That these ought to obey God rather than men, Acts 5:29, and that the submission that must be given to men must be given to them for the Lord's sake, 1 Peter 2:14. Thus I conclude with the Apostle's words in 2 Timothy 2:7, a little varied but not misapplied, quote, "Consider what we teach, and the Lord give you understanding in all things," end quote.